Welcome to Obscura Files. If you want to understand the darkest corners of human history, subscribe, because we're just getting started. War has rules, and when those rules are broken, what happens isn't just illegal. It's something so disturbing that most people can't even finish reading about it. Today, we're going through every single war crime that has shaped international law as we know it. And trust me, some of these will make you question everything you thought you knew about modern conflict. Let's go. Child soldiers. The youngest victims of war aren't always the ones who die. Sometimes, they're handed a weapon. Recruiting children under the age of 15 into armed forces is classified as an extremely serious war crime under international law. And the reason goes beyond the obvious cruelty. Children are used precisely because of their innocence. They move through checkpoints without suspicion. They are sent into places where adults would be shot on sight. They are, in every sense of the word, disposable shields. And the people who use them know exactly what they're doing. The International Criminal Court has prosecuted commanders specifically for this crime. And yet, right now, today, there are children carrying rifles in active conflict zones. So here's a question I want you to answer in the comments. Do you think international courts are doing enough to stop this? Keep that thought, because by the end of this video, you might change your answer. Murder of civilians and prisoners of war. This seems obvious, right? Don't kill unarmed people.
And yet, this is one of the most committed war crimes in history. Intentionally ending the life of a civilian or a prisoner of war is a war crime, regardless of who gives the order, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the flag on the uniform. The Geneva Conventions exist specifically because of what happens when armies decide that certain human lives simply don't count. Tribunals like the ICC have jurisdiction over these cases, and the sentences can be severe, but only when the perpetrators are ever actually caught. That's the first crack in the system, and it won't be the last one we see today. Cluster munitions. Now imagine that same field in Laos I mentioned at the beginning. You're not stepping on a rock. You're stepping on something that was dropped from a plane 50 years ago and never exploded on impact. It just waited. Cluster munitions work like this. A single bomb opens in the air and releases hundreds of smaller submunitions across a wide area. The logic is military efficiency. Cover more ground, neutralize more targets, faster. But here's the horrifying part that doesn't make it into the military briefings. A significant percentage of those submunitions don't detonate on contact. They just sit there, in fields, in playgrounds, in the dirt under someone's house, and they stay armed for decades. Children pick them up because they look like toys. Farmers hit them with plows. Aid workers find them while trying to rebuild schools. Every single one of those interactions is potentially lethal. And this is not ancient history. Laos is still one of the most heavily bombed countries per capita in the world, from a war that officially ended more than 50 years ago. Millions of unexploded submunitions remain underground right now, as you watch this.
And the argument for continuing to use them? Tactical efficiency. Because apparently the long-term mass killing of civilians is an acceptable side effect if you win a battle faster. Keep watching, because what comes next makes cluster bombs look almost rational. Incendiary weapons. The sky turns white, then orange, then everything burns. Incendiary weapons are designed to ignite their targets using substances like napalm, thermite, or white phosphorus. They don't just destroy buildings, they consume oxygen, creating conditions where survival becomes physically impossible, even for people who are not directly hit. White phosphorus deserves its own paragraph, because it is one of the most terrifying substances ever weaponized by human beings. It ignites on contact with air. It cannot be extinguished with water. It continues burning even after it embeds itself in skin and tissue. Survivors describe wounds that keep burning after they've already reached the hospital, after the doctors are treating them, because the substance is still reacting with the oxygen in the room. Technically, white phosphorus has legal military uses, illuminating battlefields, creating smoke screens. The legal line is whether it's being used against combatants in open areas or whether it's being dropped on densely populated civilian zones. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That line gets blurred constantly. International treaties restrict it, but enforcement depends entirely on whether anyone with power actually cares enough to act. The emotional scars left by incendiary weapons, entire families trapped in uncontrollable fires, persist long after the smoke disappears. Torture. In the dark rooms that exist in every war, things happen that no legal document should ever have to describe.
And yet they do, because it happened, and it keeps happening. Inflicting severe physical or mental suffering on civilians or prisoners of war is explicitly prohibited by the Geneva Conventions and the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The reasoning isn't only moral. Torture is also notoriously unreliable as an intelligence method. People in unbearable pain say whatever they think will make it stop, true or not. And still, it persists. In detention centers, in basements, in places that are deliberately kept invisible. The sentences for those convicted can include significant prison time, but conviction requires exposure, and exposure requires someone willing to look. Sexual violence. This is one of the most underreported war crimes in history, and also one of the most systematically deployed. Acts including sexual slavery, forced prostitution, and other forms of sexual violence are recognized as war crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. These aren't random acts of individual cruelty. Research and prosecutions have repeatedly shown that sexual violence in conflict is often organized, directed, and used as a deliberate weapon of psychological destruction. The goal is not only physical harm. It is to break individuals, families, and entire communities at a psychological level that lasts for generations. The scars, physical and emotional, outlast every ceasefire ever signed. Attacks on journalists. Information is power, and in modern warfare, controlling the narrative has become as strategically important as controlling territory. Journalists are killed, kidnapped, and threatened in conflict zones specifically to prevent the world from seeing what is happening. The logic is brutally simple. If no one documents the atrocity didn't happen, at least not officially. This is why attacks on media workers and journalists are classified as war crimes. Because silencing witnesses doesn't just harm those individuals. It makes every other war crime on this list easier to commit and easier to hide. Ask yourself this. How many things on this list do you think are happening right now that nobody is reporting? Exactly. Forced recruitment. Coercing or deceiving individuals into joining armed groups, dragging people into a war they never chose, is a violation of international law. This sometimes happens through outright kidnapping, sometimes through threats against families, sometimes through promises of safety or food that turn out to be lies. And it connects directly to something even more systematic: cultural erasure. Cultural cleansing. This is one of the most calculated forms of war crime because it doesn't just destroy people, it destroys memory. Deliberately destroying temples, monuments, historical archives, and cultural symbols. Anything that represents the identity and legacy of a people is a planned attack on collective existence. The goal is not just military victory. The goal is to make it as if that civilization never existed. No monuments, no records, no memory. Just silence where a culture used to be. The International Criminal Court has prosecuted individuals specifically for cultural destruction as a war crime, because killing a people's past is its own kind of murder. Attacks on medical facilities and personnel. Hospitals have a protected status under international humanitarian law. This is not a technicality. It is a foundational principle. When medical facilities are deliberately targeted, the wounded can't be treated. Diseases spread. Humanitarian crises deepen. And the people doing the fighting become effectively immune from the consequences of their actions because the infrastructure that would save their victims has been destroyed. Attacking ambulances, hospitals, and medical workers in active conflict zones is a war crime, and it happens. Constantly.
illegal deportation. Forcibly transferring populations, particularly on a massive scale, without legal justification is a war crime covered explicitly by the Fourth Geneva Convention. This isn't just about physical displacement. It is about stripping entire populations of their homes, their communities, their social networks, and their futures in a single coordinated action. The people who are relocated don't always die immediately. Sometimes the crime is slower than that. Attacks on civilians. We're back to what seems obvious, but it's worth stating clearly because the scale at which it happens is staggering. In conflict zones across history and into the present, civilians become the primary victims, rather than incidental ones. Hospitals, schools, residential neighborhoods, these are deliberately targeted, not because of military necessity, but because terrorizing civilian populations is itself a strategic tool, breaking people's will to continue, forcing displacement, creating chaos that is easier to exploit than organized resistance. Deliberate attacks against civilian populations and civilian infrastructure are war crimes, and they are among the most common ones on this list. Chemical weapons. Sarin gas, chlorine, mustard gas. These are not weapons that discriminate. They spread. They fill the air that everyone breathes.
They cause suffering that is, by any objective measure, among the worst that human beings can inflict on each other. The Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, along with instruments dating back to 1948, explicitly bans their use. The international community has broadly agreed that this particular line cannot be crossed. And it still gets crossed, repeatedly, in conflicts that receive global attention, in others that don't. Chemical weapons don't care about treaties. Forced displacement. Related to deportation, but distinct. Communities being driven out of their homes by violence or the credible threat of violence. People fleeing with whatever they can carry, leaving behind everything they built, everything they owned, everything they knew. The Geneva Conventions prohibit this. It is a war crime, and it is, simultaneously, one of the defining images of almost every major conflict in modern history. Pillaging. Armies looting civilian property, taking goods, destroying homes, stripping populations of their possessions is prohibited by the Hague Conventions and by customary international law. It is also one of the oldest forms of warfare in human history, which makes the fact that it still happens in the 21st century a particular kind of indictment. Attacks on protected sites. Religious buildings, universities, museums, historical monuments, hospitals. These places have protected status in international law for a reason. They represent humanity's shared heritage and its most vulnerable people. Intentionally attacking them when they are not being used for military purposes is a war crime. The sentences can include significant prison terms. The Hague Conventions protect these locations. And yet, the images of destroyed cathedrals and bombed museums keep appearing in the news cycle, year after year. Denial of fair trial. This one is subtle but important. Denying accused persons, including those accused of war crimes themselves, the right to a fair trial is itself a war crime under international law. The logic matters. A system that bypasses legal process to punish enemies creates a precedent that can be turned against anyone. Justice cannot be selective. It cannot be a tool of convenience. The right to a fair trial is enshrined in international human rights law. Violating it, even in the context of war, carries criminal responsibility. Forced labor of prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are protected under the Geneva Conventions. They must be treated humanely. They cannot be coerced into performing labor that is dangerous, inhumane, or directly connected to military operations against their own side. Forcing captured soldiers to work in ways that endanger their lives or violate their dignity is a grave breach of international law. And it is distinct from organized slave labor of civilians, which is its own separate horror. Biological warfare. Bacteria, viruses,
toxins engineered or deployed to cause disease and death across populations. Biological weapons are terrifying in a way that even chemical weapons are not, because they can replicate, they spread. They don't stop at the front line. They don't distinguish between combatants and children in hospitals 3 countries away. Biological weapons are banned under international law precisely because their potential for indiscriminate, uncontrollable, catastrophic harm has no military justification whatsoever. The damage they cause is not proportional to any military objective.
It is simply mass suffering, uncontrolled, and the infrastructure to produce them exists. The knowledge exists. The temptation, in moments of desperation or ideology, exists. Indiscriminate attacks, bombings, missile strikes, and military assaults that make no real effort to distinguish between military targets and civilian areas, that cause disproportionate collateral damage with no adequate military justification, are war crimes. The principle of proportionality in international humanitarian law exists specifically to address this. You cannot flatten a neighborhood to destroy one building. The law says so. The evidence from modern conflicts says that it happens anyway. Attacks on peacekeeping personnel. United Nations peacekeeping missions operate in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, specifically to protect civilians and stabilize post-conflict environments. Deliberately attacking UN peacekeeping personnel, their facilities, or their vehicles is a violation of international law. It undermines the entire architecture of international conflict resolution, and it signals, clearly, that the attacking party has no interest in a peaceful resolution to anything. Starvation as a weapon. Deliberately cutting off civilian populations from food, water, and other necessities of survival is prohibited by international law under the principle of humanity. Using starvation as a method of warfare is a war crime. Full stop. It is also one of the slowest and most deliberate ways to kill an entire population, and it has been used systematically in conflicts across every continent. Human shields. Using civilians to protect military objectives from attack puts those civilians directly in the line of fire and removes the moral and legal cover from the forces doing it.
International law is clear. Human shields are prohibited. The lives of civilians cannot be used as a tactical resource. Environmental destruction. Causing widespread, long-term, and severe environmental damage that is clearly excessive in relation to any anticipated military advantage is a violation of international law. Poisoning water supplies, burning oil fields, destroying agricultural land for generations. These are not just environmental crimes, they are attacks on the future survival of civilian populations. Denial of humanitarian aid. In the middle of a crisis, which is precisely when people are most desperate, it is not uncommon for aid to be blocked. Food, water, medicine, denied to those who need it simply because they belong to a different faction, ethnicity, or political group. This is a slow death sentence for thousands of people, and it is a war crime. Complicity in war crimes. Here is the part that most people don't talk about. It is not only the person who pulls the trigger, drops the bomb, or gives the direct order who bears criminal responsibility. Providing resources, intelligence, logistics, or support that enables war crimes to be committed makes you criminally complicit. Instigation and facilitation carry legal consequences under international law. The person in the shadows, the arms dealer, the official who signs the paperwork, the analyst who provides the targeting data, can be held accountable. The law reaches further than most people think. Whether or not it actually does, consistently, fairly, without political interference, is a different question. And it is probably the most important question you can ask about everything we've just covered. Forced labor of civilians. Converting human beings into modern slaves, forcing them to perform dangerous or inhumane work under threat of violence, is one of the most widespread war crimes in active conflicts today. It doesn't only affect prisoners of war. Civilians are systematically exploited in occupied territories, often invisibly, often in ways that don't make international headlines. Every single item on this list has happened. Most of them are happening right now.
And the gap between what international law says and what actually gets prosecuted is enormous, shaped by politics, power, and the ability of those responsible to avoid accountability. So go back to that comment you were going to leave earlier. Do you think international courts are doing enough? Because after everything you've just seen, the real answer might be more complicated than yes or no. Subscribe to Obscura Files and watch the next one, because we're not done.